I want to begin by reading one of Philip Yancey's retellings of one of Jesus' famous stories. A young girl grows up on a cherry orchard just outside of Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents, a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she seethes inside. "I hate you," she screams at her father when he knocks on the door of her room after an argument. And that night, she acts on a plan she has mentally rehearsed scores of times. She runs away. She has visited Detroit only once before on a bus trip with her church youth group to watch the Tigers play. Because the media in Traverse City report in lurid detail the gangs, the drugs, and the violence in downtown Detroit, she concludes that this is probably the last place her parents will ever look for her. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen. He offers her a ride, buys her lunch, and arranges a place for her to stay. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from all the fun. The good life continues for a month, 2 months, a year. The man with the big car, she calls him boss, teaches her a few things that men like. Since she's underage, men pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse and orders room service whenever she wants. Occasionally, she thinks about the folks back home, but their lives now seem so boring and provincial that she can hardly believe that she grew up there. After a year, the first sallow signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. "These days, we can't mess around," he growls, and before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. She still turns a couple tricks at night, but they don't pay much, and all the money goes to support her habit. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside, the big department stores above her. Sleeping is the wrong word, though. A teenage girl at night in downtown Detroit can never relax her guard. Dark bands circle her eyes. Her cough worsens day by day. One night, as she lies awake listening for footsteps, all of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl lost in a cold and frightening city. She begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty and she's hungry. She needs a fix. She pulls her legs tight underneath her and shivers under the cardboard she's piled atop her coat. Something jolts a synapse of memory in her mind, and a single image fills her brain of May in Traverse City when a million cherry trees bloom at once, with her golden retriever dashing through the rows and rows of blossomy trees in a chase of a tennis ball. "God, why did I ever leave?" she says to herself, and pain stabs at her heart. "My dog back home eats better than I do now." She's sobbing, and she knows in a flash that more than anything else in the world, she just wants to go home. 3 straight phone calls, 3 straight connections with voicemail. She hangs up without leaving a message the first 2 times, but the third time she says, "Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way, and it'll get there about midnight tomorrow. If you're not there, well, I guess I'll just stay on the bus until it hits Canada." It takes about 7 hours for a bus to make all the stops between Detroit and Traverse City. Her thoughts bounce back and forth between those worries and the speech she's preparing for her father. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. It's not your fault. It's all mine. Dad, can you forgive me?" She says the words over and over, her throat tightening even as she rehearses them. She hasn't apologized to anyone in years. When the bus finally rolls into the stations, its air breaks hissing in protest. The driver announces in a crackly voice over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks. That's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks herself in the compact mirror, smooths her hair, and licks the lipstick off her teeth. She looks at the tobacco stains on her fingertips and wonders if her parents will notice, if they're there at all. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect, and not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees next. There, in the concrete walls and plastic chairs, bus terminal in Traverse City, Michigan, stands a group of 40 people, brothers, and sisters, and great aunts and uncles and cousins, and a grandmother and great-grandmother to boot. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers. Taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a homemade banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd of well-wishers breaks her dad. She stares out through tears quivering in her eyes like hot mercury and begins her memorized speech. "Dad, I'm sorry, I know," but he interrupts her. "Hush, child. We've got no time for that, no time for apologies. You'll be late for the party. A banquet's waiting for you at home." isn't there just something when you hear a story about that, a story about this mysterious, powerful presence of no strings attached grace that just draws you to it? It makes us wonder, is it even real? Is that even possible? Is it too good to be true? But we're like a bug to a light, to whatever is contained in that narrative, aren't we? There's just something about it that's so irresistible. How many times I've heard that story in different ways, it just draws me to it. And I find it fascinating that there's something inside of us that's so drawn to this mysterious, powerful presence of grace, but we're living in a time where people are just not drawn to church, not drawn to Christianity, to faith at all. We're living in a time where there's declining church attendance. In the 1990s, 51% of people attended church most weekends. In 2023, the last study showed that it was down to 30% attended church most weekends. There's a rise of a group of people in American society called the nuns. It's the rise of the nuns. And that sounds like a sci-fi movie, doesn't it? The rise of the nuns. But not the women with the hats and everything like that. No, N-O-N-E-S, nun. They have no religious affiliation. Where they're looking back at the faith that their parents and grandparents handed them. They're like, no, that's just not for me. We've evolved past that. I want to have nothing to do with that. And we see a rise of people that even grew up in church deconstructing and tearing apart the basic doctrines of the faith they were handed, or maybe even deconverting and leaving the faith of their parents. Pastor and author Zach Lambert says it this way: people aren't deconstructing because it's cool or because they're looking for excuses to sin. They are doing it because the Christians they've encountered and the Christianity that they've been handed are so unlike Christ. Pew Research did a study asking people that are not of Christian faith what they think of when they hear evangelical Christian. And the first words that came out of their mouth at the top of this study was homophobic, bigoted, politically extreme, hypocritical. They preach one thing and they do another. Or the faith that they're talking about has no bearings or any difference on this life at all. It's just about some life someplace else. It seems to me that the modern Christianity, or the way that it's expressed so often, it's just so resistible. It's almost repelling to a next generation. They're like, we have nothing to do with that. It's so resistible, but it's fascinating to me. And it bugs me that it didn't used to be that way. There was a time when the message of Jesus, the person of Jesus, the church of Jesus, it was irresistible. It drew people in from all different kinds of life and all different corners of society, where everyone was enamored with this Jesus and the message of this Jesus and the community that this Jesus was forming together. And it doesn't take long to thumb through the pages of the gospel accounts, these 4 biographies from eyewitnesses that are found in our New Testament, to see this reality right here. That people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. And he liked them too. People were drawn to Jesus that were on the outside of society, the outcasts of the religious communities that were already there. They were drawn to Jesus. People like prostitutes, tax collectors who were basically considered traitors, the scum of the earth, as they were called. They wanted to be around Jesus. And it reminds me of maybe the very first prophecy that's fulfilled in our New Testament, the angel announcing the birth of Jesus. This is what the angel said about the birth of Jesus, the arrival of Jesus in his kingdom. The angel says, I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. The angel says, I've got good news. I've got a good message. And this message is not going to leave you with dread or guilt or shame. It's going to spark joy inside of you. It's going to make you smile. It's going to make you giddy. It's going to be there through whatever is happening externally. You're going to feel joy. And guess who it's for? It's for all the people, not just one corner of the globe or one type of person. All kinds of people. When they hear this message, when they experience this Jesus, they're going to have joy. It's all kinds of people. And then a couple months ago, I was inviting somebody who was doing some work on our new church building across the street to church. I'm like, hey, you should come check out Bridgeway. I think you'd love it. You'd be welcome there. And he goes, man, no way. Why would I want to go someplace that makes me feel bad about myself? I already feel bad enough about myself. How did we get here? How did this message that's supposed to spark joy, that's for everybody, become such bad news, become not irresistible, but resistible? And there's lots of reasons, and lots of smart people will go down lots of different trails to tell you why. But I tend to agree with Lambert, who said they're encountering a Christianity and Christians that look nothing like Jesus. I'll put it this way, that too often people who have been saved by grace are real bad at practicing grace. People that are enamored with the salvation that can come from Jesus, that we're enamored with grace, and they just let it be a one-way street, and they just don't ever practice it. They don't ever dispense grace to a thirsty world. We treat it like a one-way street. Is it possible that inside of our churches, and it's possible inside of this church too, I'm not pointing fingers, that we have reduced this idea of grace to a theological concept of I get out of jail or out of hell free card, and we've stopped it right there, when in reality, the grace and the powerful presence and posture of God is transformative, and it's wide enough for everyone, and dare I say, is irresistible when we practice it in our lives. What I want to do today, I want to begin a journey for us to recover the power of practicing grace, for us to go back to look at grace and take it from just being this theological concept of unmerited favor, undeserved favor for us, and look at the way it was always supposed to be something that people that follow Jesus receive and then breathe out. We receive and then we dispense to the world around us. But it's so much more than just your get out of hell free card. When we consider grace, it's so powerful. It's so much more. Grace is this powerful presence, you guys, in the face of division and disagreement. And we don't have any division or disagreement in our culture today, too. That's all Bible stuff, right? Like, we have no idea what that's about, right? No. The reality is, with political tribalism and partisan politics, and we're heading in the middle of this presidential year, we know it's going to bring out the worst in people and divide us even more. COVID-19 back in 2020 through 2022 showed us we got lots of new fun ways to be divided and hate each other and judge each other, right? And there's a generational divide from people that have grown up and they're handing the world to their kids, and their kids are wanting to shape it and mold it and make it something different, and there's all this divide that happens. And the reality is that we idealize the very first Jesus followers, the early church. But their community, their world was as messy as you could possibly imagine as well. And they were figuring it out, following God's Spirit in the midst of the mess and the division that was there as well. You see, the early church was mostly made up of Jewish people that had trusted Jesus as their Messiah. There were traditional Jews, and then there were Hellenistic Jews that had followed Jesus. Now, traditional Jews believed that we need to be separated from the ways of the world, but Hellenistic Jews were more progressive, and they believed that they could take some things from Greek and Roman culture and mix it in with their Judaism. And there was judgment between both of these groups of people. There were also Jewish Christians that believed that anybody who was not a Jew, Gentiles, most of us in the room, they had to become Jewish before they were actually Christian. And if you were a male, that involved a very intimate surgery that you don't want to sign up for when you're 47 years old. Circumcision joke. But anyway, there was division there, like, how could we ever get along? And then there was this question of, like, there are Roman soldiers and Roman imperial leaders that want to trust Jesus. How can we let them in? They're the enemy of our people. They've occupied us and brutalized us. How could we ever let them in? There's all this division and all these questions. As my friend and author Marty Solomon says, the narrative that's predominant in our New Testament is not one of just how we can get saved and how we can go to heaven, but the predominant narrative that's in our New Testament is how in the world can God's Spirit bring together these messy, different groups of people into one beautiful, blended family. In the the book of Acts, we see this amazing thing to where they assigned the Hellenistic Jews, the more progressive Jews, to be deacons in the early church. Acts chapter 10, Peter, one of Jesus' followers, he overcomes his prejudice by this vision that God gave him, to where he went to this guy named Cornelius' house and said that you're not unclean, you're welcome in God's family too if God's Spirit has called you. There's no type of person that's unclean or not allowed in my kingdom, is what Jesus told Peter. Then Paul, who's a predominant author in our New Testament, his main mission was to include the Gentiles, the others, into this story of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. And he writes all over the place of how can we get along? How can we work together even though we're different? In the church in Galatia, he writes this letter to them. It's in our New Testament called the book of Galatians. And he says some powerful words that secular historians say were explosive in the world of the first century. Paul says this about what Jesus is doing. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, Paul is not saying that there aren't big, profound differences between these different groups, Jew and Gentile, slave nor free, male and female. He's not saying there's no differences. He's saying, but those differences will not keep you out from around the same table centered around Jesus. You're going to learn to get along because we're a new blended family that God's building. A couple chapters later, Paul writes these words that are so powerful, going beyond ethnic differences. He says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision or uncircumcision has any value. So that thing doesn't matter anymore. The only thing that counts, what a powerful phrase. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. The only thing that counts is, do you trust Jesus? And are you expressing that trust and faith through love to those around you? Saying there's going to be differences, but we're going to graciously learn to love and sit with and befriend people who are different than us. This is what grace looks like in the face of division and disunity. It reminds me of the story of Francis Collins. Maybe that name doesn't ring a bell to you, but Francis Collins is a world-renowned scientist, physician, geneticist, and he actually has discovered multiple genes that harbor multiple diseases and have been on the side of alleviating lots of suffering in our world. He was the director of the National Institute of Health for over 25 years. He served under President George W. Bush, President Barack Obama, President Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. Think about some different kind of bosses there, right? He served under all of them at leading the National Institute of Health, and then he was also the executive director of the Human Genome Project, a brilliant scientific mind and leader, but what makes Francis Collins weird and unique is that he's also a devout follower of Jesus. He finds there to be no incompatibility of a mind that trusts science and a mind that trusts Jesus. And when he came out publicly saying that he was a follower of Jesus, he was maligned by different members and leaders of the new atheist movement, like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who didn't just believe that faith was wrong or Christianity was wrong, they believed it was harmful for the world. And so they said, you can't take anything Collins says seriously. They maligned him. They debated him publicly. They wrote books in response to him to tear him down over and over again. But what's fascinating to me and what's so powerful is that Collins, in the face of all of that hatred and all of people saying that he wasn't a serious scientist, he didn't move away from these new atheists. He actually moved in to love them and to befriend them. As they would travel and have public debates, they would sit at pubs and have meals and laugh and share life together. Christopher Hitchens, which was fascinating to me, near the end of his life, he was diagnosed with cancer, and Francis Collins would go and travel just to spend time in Oxford with Christopher Hitchens, to sit around a table and love him and to serve him. And actually, Hitchens, who was writing a weekly article for a British newspaper, wrote lovingly about Francis Collins, this Christian man. He says this about Collins: this great humanitarian is also a devotee of C.S. Lewis, and in his book, The Language of God, has set out a case for making science compatible with faith. Francis has been kind enough to visit me on his own time and to discuss all sorts of novel treatments, only recently even imaginable, that might apply to my cancer. Collins, this Christian scientist, would go and travel and let Hitchens know about these experimental treatments that might actually help his unique cocktail of cancer, just to love him and to serve him and to be a friend to him. This is what grace looks like in the face of division and in the face of disunity, saying that we might see the world differently, but I'm still going to treat you with kindness, with hospitality, with radical love. This is what grace looks like sometimes. It's not defined in the Bible, like there's one verse saying this is what grace is, but we get these pictures, these images, and this is what grace does in this case. Grace is the power that makes strangers into neighbors and enemies into friends. And this is what Hitchens had experienced. And lest I, remind you guys, this is what Jesus has done for us. When we were running and doing our own thing and looking for love in all the wrong places, when we were writing a counter story with our life, trying to just build for ourselves and make everything about me, myself, and I, Jesus came towards us to not shame us, but to love us and to offer us grace. This is what grace does. Grace, in the face of disunity and division, does this. But grace also speaks to this powerful, scandalous reality called forgiveness. And we're living in a time where forgiveness is not in vogue. It's not popular. Some people actually think that forgiveness is actually destructive. But we're living in a time of not grace and forgiveness, but ungrace, to where we can just cancel people we don't like, ghost people that we don't like. There is this cancel culture thing that I know a lot of Christians malign. But come on, can we just be real Christians about cancel culture? We're the OGs of cancel culture, right? Like, we got to own this. We canceled the Beatles by burning their records and burning books. That's a Christian thing, right? We got to move past it, but we got to own that, right? But the reality is that we live in this space of our own echo chambers and our silencing, that we want to get away from people that we disagree with. But forgiveness is not something that we're great at practicing. But we have to admit that forgiveness is core to the message of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus. Not just receiving forgiveness from God, but extending forgiveness to other people. Jesus' disciples asked him, how should we pray? And in the core, the center of that prayer, he says that we must be people that say, Father, forgive us of our sins and help us as we forgive those who have sinned against us. In another one of his teachings about forgiveness, he says this, that if you want to be forgiven, you need to forgive other people, which is not a divine quid pro quo, but it's Jesus as a rabbi in a way saying that the same door that opens up for you to receive forgiveness from God is the door that needs to be opened up for you to give and extend forgiveness to other people. And this wasn't just a teaching of Jesus. Jesus lived this out on a powerful display at the cross. And his disciples, they all remember him saying these words as he was being hung on a cross to be killed by capital punishment. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And catch this, you guys. The early Jesus followers were so captivated and empowered by this message that Jesus taught and embodied that in just a few weeks later in the book of Acts, the chronicling of this early church, there was a guy by the name of Stephen who's being killed by stoning because he claimed that Jesus was Lord. And this is what happens with Stephen in his last words. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Grace is forgiveness received and forgiveness extended to other people. It was always supposed to go both ways. A couple months back, I heard the story of a guy by the name of Chris Carrier. Story of powerful forgiveness. When Chris was 10 years old, he was kidnapped, burned with cigarettes, stabbed in the leg with ice picks, and shot in the head, left for dead for 6 days in the Everglades. And by God's grace, he was found. He survived 6 days later with no brain damage from the shot to the head, but he did lose eyesight in one of his eyes. And he moved on for 20 years, just trying to continue to live after this traumatic experience as a 10-year-old. But 22 years later, he received a phone call from someone who was working in a nursing home about 3 hours away. And there was a 77-year-old man who was near death, who had confessed to the crime of kidnapping, abducting, and torturing young Chris Carrier. Chris could not believe his ears as he heard this story. There's somebody who's actually confessing to the crime that had broken him as a young child and brought so much hardship on to the rest of his life. But as Chris learned about it, he just got in the car and he started driving towards the nursing home. He had no idea what was going to happen when he got there. He just felt compelled he needed to go and meet this man, see this man. And when he got to the nursing home, he met his kidnapper. He saw that he was a brittle old man, alone, no family or loved ones around him, a body wrecked by alcoholism and regret and guilt and shame for what he did to Chris as he was a young child. So Chris sees the man who had brought so much hardship on his life. He saw him, he pitied him, and he decided that he was going to forgive this man on the spot. And he didn't just forgive him in his head or in his heart, but he forgave him with the action towards him. He decided he wanted to read the Bible to this man in the nursing home. He brought his wife and kids to meet this man, to pray with this man, to let him know that he was loved by God and that he had an opportunity to be forgiven by God. And his kidnapper at 77 years old, 8 days before he passed, prayed to receive God's forgiveness and grace for his life before he passed away. Chris Carrier, the story just spread across the news in the mid-90s, and he wrote a book called Why Forgive? And in this book, Carrier writes this about his choice to forgive this man. He says, there's a very pragmatic or practical reason for forgiving. When we are wronged, we can either respond by seeking revenge or we can forgive. If we choose revenge, our lives will be consumed by anger, but forgiveness allows us to move on. From my point of view, I couldn't not forgive him. Oh, I love that last phrase. Just from his point of view, I couldn't not forgive him. I had to forgive him. Now hear me. Forgiveness is not acting like no wrong was done. It's not just like forgive and forget. It's all good. It happens. But forgiveness is choosing to let go of your feeling of wanting to punish them. It's letting go of that and saying that I'm going to absorb that so I can move on, and I'm going to take you and I'm going to think about your experience, and I'm going to let it go and let God deal with the situation. This is powerful. It's radical forgiveness. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what practical, everyday forgiveness looks like, because this is such a radical case. But what does it look like to be a person who practices grace and forgiveness in our marriages or romantic relationships? To choose that I can either let it go, we can have a conversation and move forward, or I can let the root of bitterness dig deep into our lives, into our home. At work, when you have coworkers or teammates that drive you crazy or say things that offend you, are you going to move towards them? Or are you going to start to pull away from them and go talk about them to other people? In everyday annoyances, when someone cuts in front of you in traffic, or somebody cuts you off mid-conversation, or takes the parking spot at Target, are you going to move towards them, strike back, or shun them? Or are you going to offer them grace-filled forgiveness? Man, this is what grace is all about. We'll put it this way. In the face of when there's wrongs done to us, grace holds no record of debts to be repaid. It wipes the ledger clean. It says that this is a new start, and I'm not going to let what you've done own me or live rent-free in my head. I'm going to choose to forgive you because I've been forgiven. Lest I remind you, this is what Jesus has done for us. His posture towards us, seen in perfect display on the cross, where Jesus says that I am not going to punish you. I'm going to take this upon myself so that you can be forgiven, so that you can be free and your conscience can be wiped clean of what you've done. This is what grace looks like. And it's irresistible when we experience it. But it's our responsibility to extend it. Grace is also, it's not only just this beautiful, powerful presence in the face of division and disunity. It's not only forgiveness and wiping the slate clean. It's also powerful when it's in the face of injustice and brokenness that we experience and we see in our world, especially if that looks like suffering of other people. You know, it's interesting that we have access to so much that's going on around the world all the time, all the brokenness, all the suffering, all the injustices, all the violences that we see because of these supercomputers that we hold in our pockets called smartphones. And it's easy for us to just keep swiping by or bury our head in the sand or act like that's somebody else's problem. Or it's easy for us, I think a lot of times religious people, we go, oh, that's terrible. Isn't that terrible? What a shame. Bless their heart. But then we keep scrolling, right? But what's powerful about grace is that grace goes from the top and it soaks all the way down into the brokenness and into the lowest places so that there can be healing. And Jesus experiences and shows us a compassion that is moved towards action. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew recalls this about Jesus and his mission in chapter 9. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, that God's rule, his reign, it's coming down to earth, and it's found in Jesus. The up there is coming down here, and he's healing every disease and sickness. And then we're told this: when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When he saw people that were suffering, he didn't just feel bad, but he was moved. His gut was like hurting. He had a stomach ache, and he was moved to do something about it. This is what grace does. It's not just a stamp of, it's all good, buddy. It's not just like feeling bad about something. Grace is getting our hands dirty, skinning our knees, helping alleviate suffering, and being a blessing to people whose life is too challenging on their own. And Jesus was always going to the lowest places to let his gracious love be known, as he touched corpses that would make him culturally unclean, and he brought people back to life, as he spent time and touched people that had skin diseases like leprosy that were outcasts in society. He reinstated them and welcomed them back in. As he healed a servant boy of a Roman centurion, yes, the enemy of God's people, Jesus crossed that line to show grace and to restore them. As Jesus extended invitations to tax collectors or people that were considered traitors to come follow me, come sit at a table with me, come have your reputation restored. Jesus was always going to the lowest places to let his gracious love be known. I remember hearing this story about a young doctor by the name of William Cook, who was starting his first practice in southeast Indiana in a small town. He's fresh out of medical school, excited to go make a difference and help people. And he started his practice in a town right in the mid-2000s, 2010s, where our country was going through an opioid crisis. And his town was hit hard because of all the manual labor jobs that were there. And people, time after time, were coming into his office, and they were addicted to opioids. And he spoke in his book later that he had to overcome his prejudice, because at first he was like, oh, these people, they need to stop doing drugs. Everything would be better if they stopped doing drugs. I guess this is what you get when you get addicted to drugs. And he tells a story of one Sunday being in church and hearing about Jesus. And he was confronted by Jesus. He was unsettled by Jesus because Jesus met people in their suffering, no strings attached, and went to alleviate suffering. He saw people that were on their own without a leader, and he went and inserted himself into their story to put his arm around them and to let them know that they were not alone. No questions asked, no strings attached. And this changed Dr. Cook's whole practice and his whole attitude in treating people who were suffering with drug addiction and opioid addiction. He writes this in his book later. He says this: when they come meet with me in the office, they need to know that the relationship is safe, and they are not going to be turned away as less than human. They need to know that they are going to be seen as a person first, and then they are going to be provided access to the care that they need. No questions asked, no strings attached. I'm here to serve you. I'm going to meet you in whatever mess you're in with compassion. That is what grace looks like, my friends. Put it this way: grace reaches down to the lowest places to lift people out with no strings attached. Grace is this mysterious, powerful presence that meets you and I in our lowest moments, and it reaches out to lift us up. And it's not waiting for us to sign on the dotted line. It's not waiting for us to say magic words, but grace is God's posture towards us in our lowest moments. You guys, this is what Jesus has done for us, isn't it? When we were running down our own path, doing our own thing, when we were harming ourselves or harming others, God doesn't meet us with a shun or a finger wag. He meets us with his arms wide at a cross, saying that you are loved, and I'm going to go this far to show you that you are loved and that you are forgiven, and that my posture towards you is grace. This is what it is. Do you guys know what makes amazing grace amazing on this side of eternity? It's you. It's me. It's when followers of Jesus start to realize that grace was never supposed to be a one-way street, but it was supposed to be something that followers of God Breathe in and then breathe out, that we receive and then we extend and dispense into our thirsty world, where grace is not the letter of the law, but karma is, and dog eat dog is. We're called to disrupt that with grace. One of Jesus' disciples, Peter, writing years later to an early group of Jesus followers, he says this: each of you, talking to Christians, should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Let me ask you, if you're a follower of Jesus in the room, have you ever considered that this is part of your role? That this is part of your job? That your job is not just to make sure you don't say that certain four-letter word, or that you watch The Chosen when the new season comes out and tell people about it, or you go to Hobby Lobby and you get the sign and you post the things on Facebook. That's not your main job. Peter, who spent a lot of time with Jesus, says that part of your main job is to be a steward of God's grace, to distribute God's grace to those around you, to make sure that nobody misses it, but that they get to experience what it's like to be loved by God with this posture that God gives us as humanity, as grace. This is part of your job. It's part of my job. Let's not miss it. So today, we're gonna close out the lecture portion of church today, and we're gonna go into the lab, because I want to give each and every one of us, we want to give each and every one of us an opportunity to be stewards of God's grace to our thirsty world today. So to do so, we're going to do something we've done just the last 3 years, but we're not going to receive an offering today. Today, we're actually going to mobilize an offering at church today. We're going to distribute an offering at church today, because today we're doing a reverse offering. And you might be asking, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Great question, because this doesn't happen every time you come to church. And I know we've got some first-time guests in the building today, which is like, this does not happen every Sunday. But we're going to do a reverse offering. We want to help mobilize the people of God to not just experience God's grace, but to distribute God's grace. So here's what we did. We took, over the last quarter, our average financial offering per week. And we divided that by our average attendance over the last quarter as well. And we split this up into envelopes, to where everyone that's in church today is going to receive an envelope with $55 in it. And here's what we're going to do. We're not asking you to give this money to Bridgeway, but this is a gift that we want you to have eyes to see, ears to hear, to distribute and spread God's grace and God's kindness to those around us today. Now, hear me. I want to thank so many of you, as I look around, that are giving weekly, monthly, consistently to the mission of God here at Bridgeway, and this is part of that. We believe that in a world where everybody thinks that Christians are after your money and they're just trying to get into your wallets, they're just trying to get money from you, we believe that financial generosity should never end with the church, but it should actually be a way that we give through the church to our community and to alleviate suffering around us. So thank you so much for those who give weekly and monthly to our church. We've planned for this in our budget, and you guys just came to church physically at the right service, and sorry for those joining us on Facebook. The next thing I want to say is, if you find yourself in a hard season financially, and you're here with your spouse, or you're here solo, or you're here with your kids, and $55 or $110 is going to alleviate some of your suffering and some of your challenges at home, I want you to hear straight from me. You use this money for you and your family. Feel no guilt about this. Let this be a gift from the body of Christ to you. No strings attached, no questions asked. I hope you feel God's love and God's grace through this for you. But to those among us that we don't need this to eat, to live this next week, man, don't let this envelope sit on your dashboard. Don't let it sit in your cup holder. Don't let it sit in your laptop bag. Have eyes to see, have ears to hear, where you can dispense grace, where you can practice grace to those around you. Maybe for you, this looks like having $55, putting in $55 of your own money to go double that up. Maybe this looks like getting you and your kids together and thinking and scheming together. Who can we bless? Who can we be kind to? Who can we share God's good grace with? Maybe this is for you, partnering with Valley of Grace through our community impact and buying items, or taking your kids shopping with you and using the $55 to buy items that are needed, or sending it directly to another local nonprofit. Maybe for you, this is someone you know, a neighbor who's suffering or struggling, and you say, hey, I want to bless you. And you can do it anonymously by dropping it in their mailbox too, so it's not like that kind of a thing. But we wrote on every one of these envelopes, we wrote this: you are so loved by God and by the people of Bridgeway Church. We hope that this blesses you and lightens your burdens. You guys, we have an incredible opportunity to do some kingdom of God style mischief and kindness this week. Don't let this pass you by. Every one of us, we are here for this moment so that we can be a part of what God is doing in the world, to right the wrongs and to spread love and his grace and his kindness. Let's not miss it. The author of Hebrews says this in the middle of the writing here. I think this is a good challenge for us. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. No one. Let that be our charge this week. That in a world where Christianity is defined by some people that gather together, sing some songs, and believe some things, man, may we tell a louder, more beautiful counter story that the people of God who are saved by grace, we love to practice grace to those around us as well. See to it that no one misses the grace of God.